Hi everyone, happy Friday and welcome to the latest AIMI Happy Hour. We've got an exciting session today where our topic is the unglamorous aspects of AI in medicine with glamorous people. And I'll start by introducing everyone, just do a brief intro. So I'll start with Matt. So Matt, I've had the incredible pleasure and honor of knowing over the past many years. And Matt's been one of mine and several others' most fun collaborators to work with. And obviously has had incredible impact at the intersection of machine learning and medicine. Our second panelist is Monica. So Monica is a third-year computer science PhD student at MIT and has done some really cool research on using machine learning to comprehend longitudinal clinical notes and improve the clinical documentation process. And fun fact, Monica was at Stanford before moving to MIT. So, and then our third panelist is Adriel. Adriel is currently finishing up her master's in computer science at Stanford, and previously did her MBA at Stanford as well, and will be joining Apple's Health AI team this summer. Adam is our fourth panelist. Adam works in the intersection of machine learning and oncology and has developed algorithms to both predict future cancer risk and design personalized screening policies. And his tool has been clinically implemented at MGH and used to interpret hundreds of thousands of mammograms. Finally, we have Chloe. Chloe is a second-year resident in anesthesiology at MGH in Boston. And prior to residency, earned her MD and MS in biomedical informatics at Stanford, where she did research at the intersection of machine learning and medicine, and is currently in the MGH's prime research track, where she's working at the intersection of machine learning and anesthesia. So I'll just welcome everyone. Cool. All right. So I'm going to kick us off with the first question, which is about whether or not it is glamorous to do the following. And I thought we'd start out with problem selection. And just to give everyone a little bit of background, I often wonder, with all the glamour that surrounds machine learning, and especially machine learning for medicine, there's so many aspects which we wouldn't want to ever do twice in our day. There's this movie About Time where the idea is there's this character who can time travel and says that they live every day twice, the first time just as it usually is, and the second time enjoying things more, but some days are worth living only once. And we have some days in our lives which are probably worth living only once as they relate to machine learning and medicine, and today's going to be a session on that. So I'm going to kick us off on asking the panelists the following question, which is it glamorous or unglamorous to choose to work on problems that are directly touching doctors or patients, or work on operational problems, or work on discovery problems? So I'm going to start us off with Matt, and maybe we'll just go around.
Well, thanks, Pranav. Yeah, I like the analogy, and I can definitely think of days that I wouldn't want to live again. but I think in terms of, sort of the priority order, things that interact with patients, things that are operational or sort of, just discovery problems. I guess, the things that I think that, attract the headlines and are easier to communicate maybe in a lot of ways are certainly the things that are directly patient facing or parts of the usual, medical workflow. So when you get a problem like that and, provided everything makes sense, which sometimes it doesn't, as I'm sure we'll get into, but, that certainly has a kind of an immediate, I have a visceral understanding of that's cool or that's great, or I can see where that works. Operationally, I think we all, believe we should be working in that space, but unfortunately, it does not attract the same sort of attention in a lot of ways, partially because if you haven't spent, 10,000 hours, 100,000 hours, or whatever in healthcare, like it's hard to really understand why a given use case is, why would we want to work on that? What is the real, so it's trying to figure out why it's important. And again, a lot of what we do is very multidisciplinary, right? So you have to translate the medical over to the machine learning and vice versa. And that's a lot of effort. So it's a lot easier if you just said, I'm going to diagnose skin cancer. I think we kind of get that, right? There's not a lot of background you need necessarily, right, to just jump in and think about the problem. But, on the discovery side, I think that's an area where I, again, in certain cases can really be the most transformative, probably, right? And so doing things that we already do well by, automating that's fine. And I think there's a lot of work on that, but trying to do things that we can't do or discover things that we can't, do on our own or learn on our own, that to me is maybe what moves the needle the most. And I'm not sure how to rank that for glamour, but I think if you hit a home run and you're able to do something that's a new discovery, then that has a lot of downstream impact, right? And so it definitely moves the needle quite a bit.
Definitely. Adam, I know you've worked on both the clinical side and the discovery side. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of really important work in the operational efficiency side. And we're going to see like more and more of that, especially like in the corporate space, because that's a lot of what like makes most financial sense and a lot of like the kind of immediate critical path. But problem selection and the kind of problems we can't do and like using ML to say, like we have a current realm, what we think is scientifically possible, how can we push that realm, is by far the most, like at least to me, most exciting and glamorous. It's more exciting and glamorous in the problem setting than the actual doing, because you have the unbridled dreams before reality gives you real constraints. It could also, like, as soon as you have any one of them, you don't know what, like, if that piece works, what other things and new problems it enables along the way. Like, we cared a lot about like cancer risk stuff, but if you want to study cancer prevention, it's really hard to do that unless you have really high powered cohorts to study even this kind of preventative drugs on. So like every little piece gets you new things. And I think especially in academia, it's like, it's most exciting to do that where it's kind of not immediately or necessarily ever going to be worked on by industry problems, because it's like kind of out there. It's not sure if it's like this kind of thing will necessarily make any immediate financial return, but if you can make it possible, then you give yourself the time and flexibility to find that. So I think it's like high glamour and concept problem selection, low glamour and other aspects of the process. It's a different glamour curve.
That's fair. Talking about unbridled dreams, so I guess for Chloe, in terms of problems that you see in clinical medicine, just along the same lines, there are probably a lot of problems that are, not useful to have machine learning solutions on. How do you think about this?
I've been thinking about this a little bit recently as I try to find a research project during residency. And I think, in medical school, I was sort of uninhibited by specialty. And now that I've chosen a specialty and I'm in anesthesia, I'm trying to sort of find a problem that's within anesthesia and is exciting for machine learning. And I'm realizing that there are a lot of categories where machine learning is not super helpful. I think one is sort of procedural stuff. I'm noticing that a lot of anesthesia is just sort of like, drawing up your drugs quickly and smoothly so you can give them immediately when a patient is hypotensive, or like intubating or putting in a line or something. So, I mean, unless, that sort of would be very advanced robot that could do a central line. And I don't think machine learning is really there. So I think procedural stuff, I think when a lot of sort of small, inconsequential in and of themselves decisions need to be made like sequentially. I think that's another one where it could be tackled potentially by reinforcement learning, but that's a little bit more challenging. Like, for example, in anesthesia, you're sort of reacting every minute or two to the changes you see in the vital signs. And that's just not really a problem that is easily tackleable with machine learning. So I think things that are low cognitive load and many decisions, sort of like many small cognitive load decisions, are difficult to sort of translate to AI. I think it's where we have large diagnostic problems or things that take a lot more time than they should for a human. That's when, machine learning and AI can really come in handy.
On that note, I'm gonna ask Monica next. So the problems that you work on, very big, long-standing problems in biomedical informatics. They also touch on the operational components here. So I'm curious what you think about this.
Yeah, I think I've kind of stayed away from anything directly touching doctors and patients, just because I think it feels higher risk to me compared to I think there's a lot of operational wins. So some work that work that I'm currently doing with collaborators is working to make the EHR at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center easier to use for physicians. And I think any clinician who's listening in who's used an EHR can probably say it's not their favorite piece of software. And there's a lot of little design decisions that can be made there, because a lot of this EHR software is kind of not up to date with kind of current software standards of what you might expect out of a new app or something. So there's a lot of wins we can get operationally there, just like by adding autocomplete and features like that, which aren't particularly glamorous. I don't think there's ever going to be an article that's like, researcher makes it easier to collect one structured variable, but it can actually be really valuable for downstream research. And a lot of the other work I do is, given that we don't currently have that structured data, how can we, make cohort construction easier, identify confounders in clinical text, which, as people have said before, it's like a very small step in kind of this long, kind of more ambitious process, but in itself might not be considered the most exciting.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine any operational AI making headlines in the same way as treating cancer or making the next discovery. Adriel, I want to bring it to you. In terms of some of the companies you've seen working in the space, there seems to be a disconnect between what seems exciting from a scientific perspective and what actually makes an impact out there. So what's your thought?
Yeah, it is. It actually is. It's interesting because to hear what Monica was saying there is that it's true that I do feel like a lot of these sort of easy wins, like the low hanging fruit in the space, are operational. And, I wish every company could be like 10x genomics, which makes and sells like these super cool gene sequencing technology. And obviously 10x is crushing it. But I think a lot of really successful companies in healthcare are frankly these kind of like pretty boring business models that aren't that fun and sexy to talk about or think about. It's like one example I'm thinking of is like private equity roll-ups. You'll see this a lot in healthcare companies. And these are very, very successful business models because they basically just come in, buy up a ton of different doctors' practices. So for example, RAD Partners, Radiology Partners, who I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with, is a really successful version of one of these. And they basically come in, they buy up a ton of practices and then just kind of aggregate all of these doctors together, and they're, making billions of dollars in revenue, and it's incredibly successful, but it's certainly not what we think of as glamorous by any stretch of the imagination. And so I think it's definitely, I would say from a purely business perspective, that's glamorous to me, because I think thinking about business models that are really successful and actually work and incentivize people to do cool things is glamorous, but it's not as sexy as curing cancer, certainly. But I think that it's harder to have a strong business model that, is taking risks, the kind of risks that you would need to take in either a high stakes scenario with patients, or the kind of investing risks that you would take if you're investing in some new technology that hasn't been totally proven out yet. So glamorous to me, but maybe not glamorous to most.
In terms of problem selection, I think all of us work on problems which have a lot of application in terms of the real world, and we hope this technology gets translated. One of the questions that I often come across is, when I find a problem, there are often other teams, either in industry or academia, that are also working on the same problem. Does that make you more or less excited to be working on the same problem? Is it more glamorous that other people are working on it, or is it less? Anyone can start. Go for it.
I think in some settings, if no one works on the problem for too long, maybe it makes it a little less glamorous. It makes it a little suspicious. If it's too crowded of a space and it becomes a kind of space where like this kind of really small incremental boost of performance, it becomes less glamorous. So I think there's kind of the most fun thing is to like help create a new space and have many new people join into it and help make it really a burgeoning space. But then I think it kind of depends like where in that curve and how long you want to help steward that community going along. I think everyone has a different kind of like patience and talent for managing that. I definitely have been maybe too hipster with my research, which it gets a little too for a long way thing has leaked into my interest, which I think like some things are very fun kind of at the start, but once a problem is established and kind of the operational direction of how things are going to get better is clear, it can be more fun and rewarding to say, okay, where's the next place where trying to be really clever about the problem setting or the modeling is going to make a big difference, rather than continuing to kind of push forward, assuming that the field is going to move even regardless of whether or not you kind of keep pushing a particular dot.
You might be getting all your ideas from the artisanal coffee shop down the street, right? But so for me, like there's the mantra in academics where you either need to be first, best, or last. Like, the first person out of the gate, the best one out, best in breed, or the final word, right? Like this is the end. And that's not always possible here, right? It's such a dynamic space and a dynamic field. But I would echo that Adam, you're kind of hinting at the sweet spot that you have to find where if it's super crowded and, like, again, everyone has the same 5 data sets that are available, and are we really going to be spending more time drilling deeper on that? And there's always depth, right? You can always do that, but it is a little bit more intellectually stimulating, certainly, but then maybe showing what else could be possible, even if it's a related area. But you're also right in the sense that, this is not this idea of merging machine learning and healthcare isn't just some new thing. Now it's been around a long, enough cycles that, some of the low-hanging fruit is definitely shown itself, right? And then there's some operational work that probably doesn't necessarily make the glamorous side, but is also showing some promise. So it does take a little bit more insight and networking to figure out what problems are, still there that need to be tackled, and what's kind of, not solved, but there's been enough work done that you feel as though, okay, that unless there's some really amazing new insider technique, I think that's going to work itself out, right, in terms of delivery. So but it is difficult to that's where a lot of the judgment comes down, and you make a lot of mistakes along the way to try to figure out what you should be working on.
Yeah,
maybe I'll say quickly from like an entrepreneurship standpoint, I think a lot of entrepreneurs starting companies will come up with an idea and then they'll do a day or two of research and they're like, oh damn, someone else did that. I just found that same company on the internet. And it's like that, it's just always going to happen. There's always going to be somebody who has sort of touched this project or this idea before you have. And you can't let that deter you, because chances are you're going to take a totally different approach, or hopefully you will, or a totally different angle at something. And you'll just sort of be spinning your wheels looking for a new project or a new exciting idea if you constantly X out the ideas that other teams have already worked on. So I mean, they're definitely, I agree with Adam and Dr. Lungren that there's a sweet spot for sure. But I think that if you're too careful about only choosing problems that no one's worked on, you're never going to work on anything, because everyone's touched some problem.
Yeah.
And I would say the same is true in academia. Like every time I have I'm like, oh, this would be a great idea for a research project. Like 5 minutes into my little Google Scholar search, I realize that someone has done pretty much the exact same thing before. But I think if there's even one, my rule is like, if there's one new piece I can add, like either one piece of data or, the most simple is just like a larger data set. But I try to like make it some aspect of creativity, and I feel like then it can become glamorous again.
Yeah, I think super recently for me, I came to my advisor with a research idea, and he was like, I think you should focus on what you're doing instead, because it's less explored. And if you don't write it, someone's going to write that paper like in the next 3 months and we're going to see it pop up. And then like, lo and behold, like we saw it come up. It was posted in our Slack. And I feel like it was a very validating experience for him, since all of my resistance of, but I want to write that paper, were really easily shut down by the very concrete evidence against that.
All of us have somewhat entrepreneurial interests or have worked in industry in this space. I'm curious, when you think about selecting problems, do you think about mapping out the tech transfer of taking something from academia to implementation before starting a project, or is that something that you like to figure out more along the way?
I can say that empirically, we were always trying to figure out along the way. Because, for us, it was never obvious because like the way distribution works is a question of like, what is the right way for this particular technology to become most impactful? It kind of depends on how well it works. So maybe it's not the right way to do it, but we tend to try to figure it out. Like, okay, once we have something we're confident in, it's like widely validated and we believe that not people can use it, given all the little factors around it and kind of where it came from, all the institutions involved, what's the best way to put it out? Which to me is, I think, one of the least glamorous parts of the process, because it's really hard and very quite uncertain and not quite but it's really important. It's like the gaps between like the dreams promised by the results and actual impact. And so it's like, but it's, I think, something we're still learning how to do, and definitely don't say we've figured out.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just in terms of, when do you say, hey, this is an idea that, we recognize, and so that, the academic sort of environment, right? I think we have a little more freedom of, Chloe mentioned creativity. That's exactly the word I use for this work in general. It's just such a great field where you can, again, I look at the machine learning landscape as a blank canvas, and how can we sort of paint with data, right? You can kind of come up with all these sort of nerdy analogies here, but I honestly feel as though like that freedom becomes constrained if you're always considering, well, how can I make this into a product, or how can I, feed this out into industry? Not meaning translation, because I think that's still a good part of it. That's important, but I'm talking just about what's the business, what's the market, because sometimes, the market will have to come to you, right? If the technology is such that it improves the standard of care or whatever that might be, and maybe it doesn't exist at the moment. And I think that what you tend to see is, when again, part of whatever startups or other kind of companies, there's a willingness, I think, at that point to say, I believe in this enough that, almost in every case, the thing that they wrote down on a piece of paper saying they were going to do, it changes quite a bit, right? And it changes sometimes faster in certain cases than others. So I sort of look at it as like, if you want to be in that world, try to keep that creativity, try to keep your constraints as free as possible, because that allows you to sort of draw from a little bit more than just sort of, focusing only on the business case, or how exactly can I make, a profit tomorrow, whatever. Again, that's really the tension that I see, that sometimes, again, is innovative in the sense that maybe you're getting a problem from that business case working backwards. But for the most part, it ends up being, I have this cool thing. Now, how do I make money out of it? That's a difficult sort of proposition, but we think about this a lot, and certainly there's plenty of examples of, Jeff Bezos in a online bookstore. Everyone's like, that's crazy, right? There's no market for that. I don't know what you're doing, right? So I don't know if you can always, again, constrain yourself with what's available now. I think you have to think about, if you believe in it and it works and it's something that you are passionate about, that should be your guiding force.
It's funny to hear you talk about sort of the business model being a constraint, because I think when I first heard the question, my immediate thought was that the technology can be the constraint. Like, you've built this cool thing, it's doing this amazing, awesome thing, and you're positive it's going to save tens and thousands of lives. And then suddenly you realize that there's no market for it, or that it can't be implemented and you can't go to market for X, Y, and Z reason. And you're probably supposed to pivot and probably leave behind the technology, but you're like, you don't want to, because you spent so long building this amazing technology. And so I always feel pretty strongly that I mean, I've never had the luxury of being able to take something from academia into market. So I think that if you have some breakthrough technology that's going to do that, that's incredible. But I actually think that starting with the problem statement in the market is probably going to be better than starting with some breakthrough, because there's so many great ideas out there that aren't business models necessarily. And I think it's really tough to translate every single amazing thing that's happening in academia into a really viable, strong business model. And I think saying goodbye to a baby like that is really tough. Like, I think when you've built something yourself, it's really hard to be like, but we just spent a year building this out. Like, what do you mean no one wants it? Whereas if you haven't built it out yet, you're sort of more willing to be like, all right, fine, we'll move on. We'll do something else instead and pivot.
Well, I mean,
so it's funny to hear about the constraint,
To be fair, if Jeff had listened to that, then we wouldn't have, Amazon wouldn't be here. Because you have to you may have to tell people, show them, or build the infrastructure to make, if you really believe in it, to make it possible, right? That's my thought, but I totally agree with you that, you see a lot of these ideas that are just.
Yeah, I think of Amazon as being an example of not necessarily some breakthrough technology, but just a business model. Like, when I think about like old school Amazon, like that was just a business model, really, and then a website in many ways, right? And he was just sort of, but you're right that you can't listen to people say, this is never going to work, and then just abandon an idea. You're totally right there. If you really believe it.
One of the unique privileges of academia is that you can choose the baby to not be like a commercial baby, but really like just a scientific problem that's important. Like, for example, some people in Regina's lab, where I'm a student, work on antibiotic research. That problem, super important, easy to motivate. Why? If we don't have better antibiotics for antibiotic-resistant bacteria, we're going to have a really bad time. No one works on it in pharma because it's not profitable. Drug repurposing, super important, not going to be profitable. So if you care about that, like, if you want to work on that problem as a company, good luck convincing someone to throw money at you. But we have like the right incentives and the ability to do that, like, and the public infrastructure. So I think like for some technologies, the public domain can still be a good distribution mechanism. It's not like only commercial ventures. I think in a way, there's also like a natural selection mechanism where, like, if you're working on a problem that massive corp and massive amounts of money are trying to solve at the same time, it's just a matter of like timing. That's a less unique place where you have a competitive advantage. Like, the ability to think really long term, I think, is a really competitive advantage of being in a place like Stanford or MIT, where you get to like have the chance to think this kind of risky things. Part of what makes it fun, because otherwise, like, industry can give you better multipliers, better resources, et cetera, et cetera.
I want to throw out a hypothetical out there. Let's say you start working on a project, and then you write a paper, and then 6 months later, someone's commercializing the technology. Let's say you find out they were commercializing the technology based on your paper. Do you consider that a mark of your impact or a mark of credit allocation going wrong?
My answer would be viewed as a mark of impact, because there's always a giant pain to go from actual model to it being used. Yeah, so.
Yeah, I think I'm in the same boat there, where I think the amount of effort it would take to go that kind of final mile is probably effort that I don't have if I want to graduate in a reasonable amount of time. And I think there's so many details there. And I think personally, I'm not the most business-minded person, so I think I'd be excited that whatever I did develop ended up having an impact.
That being said, if they were making like billions of dollars off of like a paper that I'd be like, hey, I have some med school loans. Like, can I just have like, a couple pennies for that? I would have some feelings, but I totally agree with all of you, like, that it's more a marker of impact than anything else.
Yeah, like, I think they should like bring us on as an advisor just for like a small percent at least. Like, I think that's the minimum.
No, it's good to know it works, right? I mean, it's validating. It's super validating that you're like, hey, this is actually something we talked about and we did some early work on it. And, we're not necessarily awesome in academia about that aspect of, like, you mentioned, Monica, the last mile. In fact, that spawns an entirely new industry. Is the last mile problem becomes a new target for other companies and other ideas too. So I think it's pretty cool to see that kind of spread out, right? When you've done something that can roll out into the world.
Out of curiosity, among the six of us, do we know any companies or research that's happened with? I don't know any off the top of my head, but I also don't. Pranav's smile makes me think that he does know, but he doesn't want to say. So maybe we'll take this offline.
I imagine I have a lot of conjectures I shouldn't say.
Okay, all right.
I think I've been emailed saying, I read your paper, I want to commercialize. And sometimes I'm like, oh, we're not there yet. Like, I think like,
interesting.
I'm glad we've boosted AUCs a little bit, but I think we're, not at the like stage of research where this is actually deployment ready at all. So I've received those emails, but I think that's a different vibe. I don't think anything actually ever happened as a result.
It was nice that they emailed at all.
The final question I have on problem selection relates to the glamour or the unglamor working on relatively well-explored domains versus relatively new domains. And Monica, maybe we can start with you. Something you said earlier was your choice of working on a relatively unexplored problem, which is, I assume, part of a problem space that has been worked on for decades, but there have been recent advancements which make it more maybe tractable now. So curious if you have any stories or battle scars that you would be willing to share with us here.
Yeah, so I think, some of that kind of involves trying to create an annotated data set of clinical notes, which I did in conjunction with Chloe, who also I think has, but those definitely count as days she would not want repeated, where we were trying to create some initial labels. But I think I guess on the operational side, I think kind of what we see is oftentimes like doctors spend as much time with EHRs as they do with patients. And therefore, if we can even cut down a small amount of that time, we might have kind of huge wins just for like clinician burnout. So I think from that standpoint, but I think it's very difficult to sort of get into as compared to something that you can open source as a data set. So I think I'm lucky as someone in academia to have collaborators at hospitals that kind of allow me to do that sort of research. But it's also nice because it seems less likely that there's any chance of getting scooped there. But I think it's also nice to have friends in a lot of spaces that you can kind of bounce off of. So I think a lot of the clinical note space is proprietary just because it's really difficult information to share. So I think people doing clinical NLP often can't share data sets with one another because it's like the most sensitive information because it really gets into patient details. And I think that's something where I really wish we were able to do something like the chest x-ray community where you can like release these data sets that aren't identifying of patients and where it'd be great to be able to more easily benchmark algorithms against each other. Because right now I think basically there's just Mimic, which is great, but it's very ICU specific. And I think a lot of problems are, especially the ones I work on, are kind of over longitudinal diseases. So if you think about cancer, the set of questions you want to answer there are totally different than the ones you would want to answer in the ICU. So I think from that standpoint, slightly suboptimal, but I think a function of the space.
That makes sense. It sounds like you need Matt on your team, and then all the data releases will miraculously happen, and you'll never know all the trouble that he has to go through. Matt, I want to bring this question to you. We work in radiology. Radiology is probably the first domain that comes to people's mind in terms of where AI has had a lot of impact. There's been a lot of maturity. How do you feel about choosing problems in radiology as problems that we should try to solve in the academic context?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, obviously, it's the heart of a lot of what we do. I think part of it is sort of trying to, we started very early. We started with a narrow use case. We looked at, individual parts of the work that, radiologists might do or that imaging requires, and got some signals, I like to say, I think with some early work, but we have to, come to terms with the fact that that's not everything, even for one part of the vertical of radiology, right? There's there's obviously an entire ecosystem around medical imaging, and a lot of that involves, non-pixel data, involves timelines, that there's a lot of other complexities. So for me, as I start to, I just kind of start to back up another level and another level. So if we start to say, well, now let's look at this from the population health level, or let's look at this from the global health level, I think there's opportunities then to say, where could these technologies fit in? Not necessarily to reinforce the things that we're already doing, because I think a lot of that is kind of the approach that most folks have taken, including our group at some point. And now it's trying to say, well, what's the art of the possible? If we're just building things that could, go to market tomorrow, that's just saying that I can reinforce what's happening now. It doesn't mean that I'm changing necessarily the things that I think could be changed in the future. And again, from a population health level, or again, from a global level, you can sort of look at ways to say, we have, these techniques, we understand them better because we've been working in narrower use cases. Let's see what they can do for a broader impact. In particular, if we just drop any sort of constraints around, well, this is how it's done in healthcare. So you can't do that because that's the way we do things. I think, really trying to focus again on the art of the possible. That really is sort of how I think we sort of move to the next step. So if a particular use case you're drilling down on it works, great. Now take a step back and say, well, what's the next thing? Do you go down the deployment route, or do you go down the implementation and sort of reinforce the current situation? Or do you sort of say, well, I want to be able to think a few years ahead or 10 years ahead or whatever. And to do that, you need to, again, sort of get creative and sort of think about where these technologies could fit in, all of the things being equal.
That makes sense. Maybe radiology serves as a contrast to anesthesiology here. So I want to get your thoughts, Chloe. It's not a space in which there have been that many publications. I think there have been few enough that you've been able to track, I think, every single one of them, maybe. And I'm curious.
Not this year.
Maybe two possible explanations here. One of them is just that their opportunities are limited. The second one is just that there's not enough people paying attention. So how much would you say each of these factors are weighing in here?
I think it's hard to sort of talk about machine learning and anesthesia as like one umbrella, because I think, like, for example, we mentioned Mimic earlier, like there's been some interesting work in the ICU space, and that's like technically you could consider it anesthesia. Just recently, like a couple months ago, there were like two papers coming out, one from Switzerland predicting like early signs of circulatory arrest in the ICU. And that was like, they used a bit like an enormous data set. And it was a cool paper. They could predict circulatory arrest like up to 8 hours before it happened in patients in the ICU. I think that in the OR though, I think there's been very little. I think I sort of touched on this earlier, but I think the reasons for that are, to be honest, it's not that hard. Like what we're doing, it's like, oh, the blood pressure is low. I mean, like get a little phenylephrine, and like there are a few complex decisions that are made, but those are really varied, and they have to do with different specialties. Like we just had a grand rounds the other day about like a polytrauma patient and whether or not you like heparinize if they have like an aortic injury that needs to be repaired. So you would anticoagulate them, but they also have head bleed, so that you don't want them bleeding into their head. And like, what do you do in that situation? And I think it's sort of unique in that it interfaces with a bunch of different specialties. So the only hard problem, like the anesthesia specific problems, like, keeping a patient stable in general is like not that hard. Like a very simple model could do it. And there was actually a paper looking at a model that could sort of do the anesthesia for a C-section, because literally all you're doing is adjusting the level of a medication to keep someone's blood pressure stable. Like once you've done the spinal, you're like literally up and down. And so it's I mean, not to like knock my chosen specialty, but it's rather simple and not that exciting for machine learning. And then the hard problems are just the sort of have to do with all the different subspecialties that we like intersect with, like all the surgical specialties, et cetera, and domain specific problems within those. So I think that's one reason that it has been a little bit challenging, or it's a little thin on the machine learning in anesthesia. And I think the last thing is just people are afraid. Like when you're asleep, like psychologically, it's scary. you're not conscious, there's like one person. I mean, the surgeons are saving you in terms of like doing what they need to do and actually fixing the problem, but like the only person who's like actually looking at you is the anesthesiologist. And I think replacing that is a very large step, and one that people will not be ready for quite some time.
I think we would all rather have you than an AI make those decisions right now.
You shouldn't. Frankly, the AI would be much better, but
Cool. All right. So we have 20 minutes left, and I want to transition a little bit to story time. So when we think about unglamorous aspects, I think the first thing that might come at the top of our minds is deployment. And I know we have some war stories here. So Adam, I want to start with you to maybe describe your war stories, taking your algorithm, which you deployed for the interpretation of mammograms, and maybe how you had to travel to make that happen.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I have too many stories, so I have to like filter down and pare down for the ones that are best content for YouTube. But I think like to me, this speaks to like as a whole, we need a better ecosystem infrastructure to make doing some kinds of work easier. So, for example, like we all generally agree that we need to widely validate technologies, make sure they work on diverse populations before we roll them out to make sure they're actually doing the right thing. But doing that, in my case, meant like I flew to Taiwan. Actually, some of my friends from the UK literally cold emailed hospitals on our behalf to help us recruit new sites to help do validation with. Through that process, I met some fantastic collaborators at Chenggang Memorial Hospital in Taiwan, but they're not connected to the internet in terms of like the security regulations mean that's not possible. So to do that validation, this was in February as COVID was starting and nations were shutting down, like I want this result for this paper, fly to Taiwan, various flights were shut down because COVID restrictions started to kick in. Meanwhile, one of my colleagues has been stuck in China for like a year and a half now because of this kind of mishap. But I got there, I went to the basement, did the analysis, flew home. It was fine. Same thing. We have some great collaborators from Karolinska. We also flew over to do the analysis that kind of fit the kind of policy there. It's generally like very, very hard in order to do this kind of like really widespread validation. And so very many people don't do it because the barrier entry is too high, but we need to do better to like make that easy. So I think there's like many public, institutions like MIT trying to do a better job to facilitate that and creating a network. I think many other institutions trying to do similar things because like it's a little too much. On the deployment side, just to plug it in after, and like the process of like working with different IT teams who might necessarily care about the project in the same way as the actual like more clinical PIs care about it, and like managing it's like can be very, very difficult, but it's part of the game. You don't relive those days, but they're really important days to live.
That's great. I don't want our listeners' happy hours to be walk away very sad here. So I know you've had silver linings here. So maybe you can talk about one success story after going through all of this unglamorous work.
Well, I think in a way, the glamour would not be nearly as glamorous if not for the unglamorous parts. If I phrase that better, like because it's hard, it's very fulfilling when you bring it together. So like now we finished our validation across 8 different hospital systems. We know the model works well across all of them. We're hoping to start clinical trials. And so if not for that work, we'll not be able to be in this place, because if it's just one hospital, it'll be like, maybe it's a fluke. I don't know. I don't feel responsible to like try to share this model out. And so it's really important. And I think by doing so, we will make it easier again and again for all the like future generations of students and like different projects to do so. And like the struggle is worthwhile, and it would probably be less fun, if there's not so much struggle. The flight's not good, but once you're in Taiwan, it's nice. It's a beautiful country, so it's same thing. Stockholm's amazing. And like making friends in all these different institutions and meeting them is like part of the process.
That's fair. That's great. Adriel, in your research projects, you've worked with researchers in other countries as well, including Vietnam, and that's been enabling research that wouldn't otherwise be possible. So what's your take on this?
In terms of working with Vietnam and sort of the cross-cultural collaboration, I mean, God, it's been amazing. And I think it's one of those things, I started doing research after, we've all been sort of locked down. And so, it's something that I think certainly technology and Zoom has enabled us to do in a fairly seamless way. But I think we've just been unbelievably lucky with the partners that we've been able to work with, who I've never been able to meet in person in my life before. It's pretty extraordinary to spend like an entire year working hand in hand with people on really exciting projects, and not get that sort of same in-person feeling. But so I didn't, unlike Adam, I didn't have to fly anywhere to work with anyone in Vietnam. But one day I would love to go to Vietnam when it's, not an emergency situation under COVID times. But yeah, no, I mean, in terms of, the unglamorous sides of, the stuff that we've been doing in research, I think, I think maybe probably some of the most unglamorous is when you've like fought with some big software engineering project and you've been spending a month or two working on something, and then you decide as a team, like, you know what, let's scrap this. This wasn't working. And you're like, oh, but all those hours, like, what do you mean? But like Adam said, I think, yeah, you don't appreciate, the end doesn't feel quite as sweet and the victory doesn't feel quite as good if you haven't had those sort of those wasted hours and painful moments.
I remember Chloe, when you and I and Matt were working on a project together with physicians in South Africa. We were spending our evenings on Skype calls. We don't even use Skype anymore. Wow, I just realized. That was a way to really try to bring things out to the field, but that was a lot of effort.
11 p.m. is way past my bedtime. I don't like this time difference stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that projects like that, though, I mean, if they're international or just, there's a theme here, which is sort of the collaborations and the partnerships that you're building to sort of move this technology to the next stage, right? I think that is just amazing, and it's worth the effort for sure. But the other thing that it brings, at least from all the things that we've done in every kind of area, is, it actually raises more interesting questions. I mean, and again, in the academic space, I'm sort of like, great, another problem. That's something we can work on. I'm not worried about an investor. I'm worried about just trying to get to the bottom of it. And I think that a lot of this work that we've talked about in terms of collaborative work and implementation in particular is bringing what I'm calling, I think, sort of now, I guess, the day two problem, right? So we can hook things up. We can do a validation. Okay, then what? Like, there's an entire field of human-computer interaction that we have to solve to figure out how AI plus the human is going to be better. Because right now, there's moments when the AI is better, the human's better, and there's moments when they're together, they're worse, right? So we got to solve that. And then there's the whole model monitoring and making sure it's fair and making sure that over time it's still maintaining its performance. That's another huge area. This is all opening up doors, and I think that we're learning as we go. And underpinning some of that is the idea that we are making data available. We're trying to open our models. We're actually showing some of our problems. And we're making collaborations that, frankly, I don't think we would have been brought together in the way that we have at the level we have. Certainly not hanging out in the basement in a hospital in a foreign country. Like, these are the kinds of things, I think, that, again, these are the war stories that you tell, but they lead to great things. They really do. And even, again, if it's a roadblock, I look at those as just saying, great, I'm glad we discovered it. Let's solve it.
One of the aspects of this translation that I think will become more glamorous with time is this interface of AI and HCI. And Monica, you've been doing some very cool work at this intersection. What's been your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think first, my number one thought is always, why didn't I take HCI classes at Stanford? I think I had been very laser focused on machine learning and the math. And I had kind of been why do I have to think about people? And then I think as soon as I started the PhD, I was like, oh my God, everything is about people. What were you doing? So I think there's kind of all of these places in our processes where we've had to really, and I've been working with great HCI professors at MIT who have really kind of helped ease that process for me. But I think just kind of examples. So in one case, we basically, so the thing that Chloe was working on with us was how can we make annotation of clinical text easier? Because the largest label data set out there is about 100 notes, which is just not on the scale of what exists in NLP more broadly, where they can just kind of pull data sets off Wikipedia, basically pre-labeled. So we're like, how can we make that annotation process not the most painstaking thing, which I forever always thank Chloe for. And part of that was we're like, we can provide decision support in doing the labeling. So like any really easy low hanging fruit where, you see the word HTN and you're like, that's always hypertension, and we can just automatically label it. So maybe we can start with a document that's like 70% labeled and then have clinicians do the rest. And I think there was this huge divide in people we talked to had been in the space before between that's amazing, that's the only way anyone could do it, and then also that's going to like forever bias the people using it. So we then had like, they won't be able to kind of see past what's already on the page. So then we conducted a user study, and I am thankful to my undergrad who actually like did the painstaking work of the hours of being on, and I guess we did it all via Zoom because of coronavirus, where, for like hours, I went to the first few, we're just kind of watching people do this task over Zoom, and kind of getting a vibe of like, how are they being influenced on top of quantitative data. And then I think in implementing the EHR, I never thought about like browser preference. I wasn't ever going to be like, people are going to be really loyal to Internet Explorer. And that's something I have to, that's something that we kind of figure out in terms of there's just really different user preferences, whether it comes to like browsers to use your software, or particularly between, someone who's relatively new to the situation might adapt to your software, whereas someone who's used to the existing EHR and has been in the ecosystem longer might take longer to kind of like recalibrate themselves. And I think there's all these little things where I had never thought about that when we begun the project, that I kind of had to become more proficient in.
I must say I want Monica designing my EHR, because having annotated notes pre Monica's little masterpiece in post, it was quite a different experience, bias or not. I don't care. It was much easier afterwards. Thank you, Monica.
I want to talk about the technical aspects and talk about how glamorous or unglamorous they are when working on AI for medicine problems. Maybe on this one, I'll start with Adriel, just to contrast the glamour of being in Anna Wintour's office to going to migrating code bases from PyTorch to PyTorch Lightning. What's that transition been like?
Yeah, it's a far cry from the Vogue closet to hovering over your laptop and working on that. I would say that was a realization where I like really just appreciated how special it was to have collaborators and partners around, just like people only a Slack away to be like, oh my God, I'm going to kill myself over this one error that I keep getting. Like, Pranav, what is going on? Or Akshay, please help me. Or, I just feel like I was just really lucky to have other pairs of eyes to help me along sort of those long hours, sort of fighting just error after error after error after error. But what's cool is that like once it was done, so we were moving everything over from PyTorch to PyTorch Lightning. And once it was done, then you just see everyone else sort of interacting with this new repo and new code base. And that part is really cool. And you're like, oh, great, this was helpful. And this saved other people hours, even though I spent a lot of hours on it. So I think, again, high reward, but high pain as well. And just how important it is to have people around you to help out and be a second pair of eyes. Because I think that when you're sort of so deep in a problem yourself, it's like having someone with a fresh pair of eyes come in is everything.
I think working in teams is obviously a very, very important part of doing this research well. I want to ask Chloe, so as someone with experience on the clinical side, working in these cross-functional teams, one of the unique things that you're able to do, which is often, I would imagine from the outside, very unglamorous, is be able to label data. And you've had your fair chunk of time doing labeling tasks, which you maybe were not the most excited about. So what's your take on that?
I would say there's sort of different levels of unglamorousness in terms of labeling data. It's almost like different levels of hell. No, I'm kidding. It's very useful. And it actually can be very satisfying. Like I remember for our like TB and chest x-ray project, just like segmenting the lungs was actually like strangely satisfying. Cause it's like not a hard task. So that's sort of like level one in terms of like painless, and you can like get through some things, and you can like do it as you're watching TV or listening to the podcast or something, and it's like very painless. I would say it's sort of like the lowest level, like the depths is like clinical notes where there's not really a correct term, and you're like sifting through an ontology that like the search function doesn't even work, and you're like, is this, first of all, what did this person mean by this abbreviation? Second of all, like in context, what does it mean? And third of all, what does the ontology mean? And you don't even know if you're doing it right, and you just feel like you're doing a terrible job as you're going. So I would say that's sort of the worst type of labeling. I guess those are my thoughts.
That's fair. I remember one time when you were labeling, and I might have been labeling as well, and then I called Matt, and Matt was looking at the labels on his phone and being like, "No, guys, you're missing this. You're missing this part. Here's how you do it." And then was guiding us over the phone of how to properly segment the lungs.
It was sort of like the blind leading the blind, and Matt's just like, "Oh, guys."
Listen, like, I mean, I'm always, to be fair to you, I mean, it's amazing what, the cross-disciplinary teams, the kind of learning that transfers to either side, though, because honestly, I feel like, when any student works on a medical project and they commit to it, they like, this is their jam. They really want to, I feel like, spend a little time with the radiologist, have a few interactions, and all of a sudden, like, I mean, before long, I'm turning to Pranav and saying, "Hey, what do you think about this X-ray?" Right? I mean, the amount of hours you've spent on that one problem is probably equivalent to, expert radiologists. I will say that in terms of, labeling, usually when I hear any word that's remotely related to segmentation or pixel, I'm out, because you sort of think about, I'll do the study level, okay, maybe series level, maybe bounding box. All right, now we're getting a little hot. And then you go to pixel, and I'm not, but I have a lot of respect for those that have sort of figured out workflows, to Chloe's point, to make that easier. And that's certainly still a big need, frankly, as someone who deals with labeling and still labels, and other people label with us, figuring out a way to make that less painful. That is a huge bottleneck, a big pain point. And obviously that's, we've all felt it.
On the other side of the puzzle, and I know we only have a couple of minutes left, is trying to figure out how to make things less data hungry. And there's, a lot of effort towards that. And Adam, you've been exploring quite a few different approaches to make that happen.
Yeah. It's sometimes shocking how data hungry approaches are to make models not data hungry. So we've been exploring a lot of different ways to do like pre-training, given CT scan, to try to like learn some like that structure. And I think, the basic intuition that if we want to model CT scan and do this in a way that's sample efficient, ImageNet is like not the global optima that like was, drawn up by the universe. So like, this is the mathematical optima that will explain all CT scans. As you showed in your work, video pre-training does a massive difference, super good. But it's equally unsatisfying if like the universe and all the laws of nature brought us to kinetics is the natural pre-training task to understand lung cancer progression. It gives us like way more points, very important. But it feels like there's something there and we need to figure it out. And we've been trying many different ways to get there, but it's like as a whole, it's been challenging. And I think this kind of like, how do we better leverage our structure for downstream tasks is like almost a central ML problem. Like, we have this in like computational chemistry. We have this like kind of every single case, and there's like making a scale to that long tail distribution is kind of everything. I don't think we've really figured out a lot of this in a pure sense for most volume tasks, including MRI and CT. But we'll keep pushing until we do, because it's gonna work eventually. Like, I refuse to believe the kinetics is the global optima.
You're talking about people doing aerobics and skateboarding is not the same as what you're saying. That's crazy.
There's this trend towards moving to bigger and larger models, and that's sort of mainstream. So I'm appreciative of Monica, your research efforts on being able to integrate ontologies and maybe less data-hungry approaches and incorporate those into our learning algorithms. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the times what's kind of the reality of it is if we want to have something that works on a hospital's back end, like maybe having like a Roberta model is not going to be like something that like they have the infrastructure or want to use just for, you know, your one model. So I think for a lot of like those types of applications, we've really focused on having something that's a very compact model where, you know, for the autocomplete model, we want it to run instantaneously. Like we want there to be no latency available to the user or it'll affect their typing process. So in systems like that, I think smaller models are often really nice. And I think this is kind of a problem with like machine learning as a whole and not just machine learning for healthcare, where I think the like publishing process makes us like have to go for a very fancy model. And I think there's huge problems in that there's really like not a lot of like publishing quality of the like that looks like, hey, this linear regression actually did way better than this other thing. Or, you know, the AUC difference is like 0.01 points if I throw like all of neural nets at this problem over like linear regression. But, you know, now I don't use all of my compute. I can finish it in like 1 minute instead of waiting for hours. So I think that's kind of a thing with machine learning as a whole. But I think I'm a huge fan of making sure you start small and see that like if it gets you where you want to go.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks all for this fantastic discussion. I'm supposed to do a closing on our panel today, and I think I would really not be able to summarize as well as you have some of the ways in which AI in medicine can be unglamorous. So I won't attempt to do that, but I will say to our listeners that everyone on the panel are people I really admire and follow, and are already doing great things in the field. So go follow them on Twitter or wherever else you are. I think Clubhouse is no longer a big thing, but you never know. But safe to say Twitter is probably a good bet. But thank you all once again for being on this panel. It's great sharing it with you.
Thanks, Pranav. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, guys.